So welcome everyone to our Buddhist Path of Awakenings course as we retraverse, some of us for the multiple times, volume 1 of the Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma, dealing with the path of individual liberation, which is another sobriquet for the Hinayana path. And we are working our way through this volume. Tonight, Barry is going to lead off discussing chapter 7. Barry.
All righty, let me switch the spotlight. Okay. So, welcome. It is interesting going back through this material repeatedly, I must say. Anyway, last week the subject was how meditation and practice work together and relate to each other interactively, and also about the non-theistic nature of the path. So now we're on to the path, the vehicle, and the traveler. And he says we have the teachings, we have our life situation, we have practitioners who are going along the path. So we need to clarify the whole thing. The idea of yana, or vehicle, is that we are making a journey from somewhere to somewhere else. So what is meant by path, vehicle, traveler, and how do they relate to each other and to us? So the word yana, I know that this is material that is familiar to many people here, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but the word yana literally means vehicle or cart or chariot. And in one sense, it refers to a body of the Buddhist teachings that came to fruition at a certain time historically. The transmissions of the teachings of the Buddha evolved over time. The early teachings were just the teachings, and then later became known as the Hinayana. And that's because a new body of teachings emerged and was thought to be superior. So the previous teachings were the lesser teachings, the Hinayana, and these new fabulous teachings were the Maha, or greater yana. And then there's the Vajrayana. In fact, there's 9 yanas altogether, but we don't really need to consider that now. Now, the important thing here is in this tradition, the Mahayana and Vajrayana are not considered to be repudiations of the Hinayana. So rather than lesser vehicle, it's known as the foundational vehicle. And the teachings of the Hinayana are not lacking in importance or something you just need to get through to get to the good stuff. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to say that just as these yanas are bodies of teaching that developed over time historically, they are seen and used as teachings now to guide our individual development over time. So the teachings in each yana accommodate the level of our understanding as we progress along the path. Now, first of all, what exactly is a yana? I'm going to digress a little bit here, but I think this is worth presenting. That I found this chapter challenging. I started reading through it and just got kind of lost in it. What's the point? It wasn't really gelling for me. So I found a transcript of the seminary talk that this chapter was taken from, and went through that, and my confusion only grew. And finally, I began to understand a bit and mostly started to recognize the lack of clarity in my own understanding of what jhana means, and also began to understand why I found this reading difficult. That I had not approached it with an open mind. I was skimming through stuff that didn't really seem to resonate, didn't seem to be making a point. I went in looking for bullet points and expecting a certain kind of presentation. And besides, I already knew a lot of this stuff. All the while, of course, distracted because I'm trying to put together things that I can present here. And finally, it dawned on me that I had not followed a teaching from last week's class, and that is to engage with the teachings with an open, peaceful mind of meditation. If you remember, the mark of learning is gentleness. It is being tame and peaceful. So, wow, I just got a fantastic reminder there. I love it when this happens. What I got is the importance of treating these teachings with respect, to not approach them casually, but to become present first and then relax and just take it in. So okay, what does jhana mean? The glossary in this book, by the way, if you haven't discovered it, there's a glossary at the end of the book that is sometimes very helpful. It defines jhana as path or vehicle that carries the practitioner to liberation. And he says the idea of jhana or vehicle is that of an ideal vehicle that is extremely accommodating. Its speed is based on the natural rhythm and evolution of the passengers. So jhana includes the teachings, the path, and the practitioner, just like the heading of this chapter says. The jnana is a vehicle, one in which we have a great deal of room. In the reading elsewhere, he says that it has been described as like space and like a palace. So there are no hard and fast rules. He says the Buddhist masters presented the teachings according to the concept of jhana and the idea of people making their own journey at their own speed. And that's important to keep in mind. Now, the jhanas are our guide and can be seen as a vehicle to facilitate our journey. He says, within samsaric world, a new road is being created. A highway is being introduced. In the midst of the samsaric countryside, a path has been cut, which we might call a spiritual path. Samsara is the world we inhabit, our daily lives. Then we find this path that does not just follow along. It leads us away from the suffering. Amazing, I think. The teachings are connected with our basic state of existence, and the sophistication of a particular vehicle depends on our situation and state of mind. And as you progress with these teachings and you stick with it, go from one jhana to another, many of the teachings remain. And meditation and practice and all of these things, but the nature and understanding of it changes, and sometimes what it's called. So all of this is to say that it can be helpful to think of the path that we are on as something apart yet within our daily life. That we are following the path in the midst of our ordinary lives, and at the same time, it is addressing something transcendent. So, we're on a path that carries us to liberation. And naturally, you may ask, how am I doing? At times it may seem that you're not getting anywhere, not just getting it. And other times it can be very exciting, revelatory. And of course, the question I hear is, how long is it going to take? He says, once you're on the path, you may seem to be going nowhere. You are still following a schedule, taking on a particular lifestyle and involving yourself in a certain psychological development. So it is not helpful to put much thought into a goal. Expectations of that kind can distract us and even blind us to what we're actually experiencing, which is kind of what happened on my first pass on this reading. The Yana vehicle is very spacious because each of us learns and progresses in our own way. And also because what we're progressing to is something that we have not yet experienced. So whatever idea we may have about what it is like to experience the truth of emptiness or enlightenment, for instance, is really just guesswork at this point. It's good to remember that each of us inhabits the world of our own experience. It is everything we perceive, everything that arises in our awareness, and then our interpretation of it or take on it. That is the landscape that we are exploring and working with. The realms that we are exploring are all within our own mind. And by the way, that is why the Buddhist path can be or is lonely. But more accurately, I would say alone rather than lonely, because each of us is finding our own way. But of course, in the company of the Sangha. So, what do we have? So, he says, you take a journey in order to realize that you are not going anywhere. On the way, you are shedding your ego, trying to surrender it completely. But when you reach the final destination, you realize that you have returned back home. And then he tells this parable that I think we've all heard, but of the children in this house keep asking their mother, telling their mother that they want to meet their father, who they have never seen. And so finally, the mom takes the kids out, and they go on this long, arduous journey. It takes quite a while. He talks about going up one mountain, down another, crossing streams. And eventually they come to this valley, and there's a house in the valley, and they go into the house, and there's their father. And then they realize that it's the same house. So, of course, this is a parable about our journey. That, first of all, that we already have this enlightened nature, this Buddha nature within us, and that really all of this is about revealing that, about clearing away all the obfuscations. And the other point of this parable that occurred to me is that it wasn't easy, right? They had to go on a long journey and work at it, but it took a while, but they finally got there. And that they saw their father for the first time because they were able to see him, that they had developed, that they were in a place where they could see it. And that's what's happening here with us. That we become aware of what our mind's doing, and then we can begin to quiet that and be less distracted and taken away by whatever's going on up here and become present. So, what is it? Oh, yes, here we are. He says, I hope I get this pronunciation right, the Lakavatara Sutra, says that as long as conceptual thoughts exist, there is no end to the yanas. And, well, there's kind of a double meaning there. One is that this vehicle will take you as far as you want to go, that these teachings continue to pertain and can take you all the way to enlightenment, however long that takes. But the larger point here is that in the end, to the enlightened mind, there is no path and no eye to tread the path. So as long as we're on the path, each of us is striving for something. We're applying ourselves to study and practice. We are evaluating our practice, our progress. There is always a very strong I in the center of that. With enlightenment, all of that dissolves. Now, that is not to say that if you become enlightened, you're spaced out and not aware of anything, quite the opposite. The enlightened mind is simply unencumbered by all of the stuff of the conceptual mind. The conceptual mind thinks, the enlightened mind knows. Yeah. So the ease or difficulty we may experience in study and in practice is simply a result of our state of mind at the time. It is what it is, and that experience will change. It is simply where we are, and where we are is constantly changing. And the same is true for all the moments of our lives, by the way. Right now, each one of us is sitting someplace in a room or outside, and that is simply the location of where you are sitting. It is where you are now. And in meditation, whatever you are experiencing is simply where you are in the now of that moment. So any kind of judgment just doesn't make sense, really. And finally, he says, the non-theistic journey is quite powerful and unedited. It is not based on a belief in any divine hierarchy or in messages coming from upstairs through thunderstorms, rainfalls, or snowfalls. So that is to say that the Buddhist approach to the spiritual journey is not theistic in the sense that you are not given some kind of reward or punishment from above. In meditation, we may have a lot of difficulty, but this is not regarded as a bad thing. We may have a very good experience. We may have the experience our minds be very calm, of easily returning to open awareness, but this is not something that will be rewarded. It just is what it is. See, there's no one there to give us a gold star for doing well, and there's no one there to give us a demerit or punish us if we do not. So finally, this journey is actually a very intimate one. Each of us is finding our own way, our own understanding, our own way along the path. The path defined by the yanas points the way, presents possibilities, provides guidance. And we study this guidance, we think about it in contemplation, and we meditate. And as we progress along the path, our awareness becomes more spacious, more encompassing, gains clarity, and we may even eventually begin to realize that I and others are just thoughts, just concepts, simply the product of the mind, the ego. So, the yanas are the body of teachings tailored to the ability to take them in. They are a vehicle which we use all the way to enlightenment. And finally, he says, Basically, mind is the journey. The particular style of working with yourself is the vehicle, and the situations you get into on the path. However, although you are on a journey, there is no point in talking about it. You don't need to talk about your journey. You just do your practice. So, in other words, just do it. It works. Okay, John.
Thank you, Barry. I want to say a few more words about this. The word jnana, we have the three basic jnanas, and then within them subdivisions into other jnanas. The three are the Hinayana, which literally means lesser vehicle. It was a name given to a body of teachings by adherents of schools that came after and wanted to establish their superiority, namely the Mahayana, which means greater vehicle, and then the Vajrayana, which means adamantine or indestructible vehicle. Vajra was a weapon that Indra, the god Indra of the Hindu religion, wielded, and it was indestructible, adamantine, diamond-like. So it means vehicle. We travel with these vehicles. These teachings evolved over and are still evolving, for that matter. And that's a feature of Buddhism. There is no dogma. There is no sacred holy writ like the Bible or the Quran. Rather, the words, the teachings, are regarded as simply useful ways to take things. Useful to whom and when? Useful to particular people at a particular time and place. They're not, words are never absolutely true. They're not the absolute truth. They are called relative truth. And that is what defines these vehicles. The teachings that are contained in them are in words. So they evolved out of a particular time and place, and they are useful. And the understanding of them has evolved and changed too over the centuries. When the Buddha died, he lived roughly from about, the traditional dates are 560 to 480 BC. After he died, the Sangha fractured. This is a common phenomenon. Look at what we've got going now with the Sangha around the Sakyong Mipan Rinpoche and how that's fractured. And it's a common phenomenon. When a teacher dies, some students go one way and some students go another. Well, in the period after the Buddha's death, in about 480 BC, it went into what is called the period of the 18 schools. There were supposedly 18 different schools, differing in their doctrines. One of these schools was called the doctrine of the elders. And in Sanskrit, that is Slaviravada. And you'll notice that in the chapter that we're going to be covering, chapter 8, relating with a teacher, the terms for a teacher they give, Slavira, elder. In that particular school went south in India and then jumped to Ceylon, where Slavira was translated into Ceylonese as Tara, and it became Theravada. Vada means doctrine. So in Southeast Asia, the style of Buddhism that evolved there is called Theravadan Buddhism, the Buddhism of the doctrine of the elders, Vada. Another school was called the Mahasangikas. This is in India. And Maha means great, Sangha means, Sangikas means adherents of, members of a Sangha. That school moved east. And around the time of Christ, it went to China, where it became the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, and became Chan Buddhism, which went to Japan and became Zen. Zen means Chan, they both mean meditation Buddhism. At the same time, yogis were meditating in the forests in the first centuries AD. And there was a sort of a collaboration between, nobody really understands because nobody was writing all this down, between Hindus and Buddhists. And there were people doing wild practices out in the forests, naked yogis, ash smeared bodies, all kinds of things, doing tantric practices that came from Hinduism, but adapting them to Buddhism. Because Hinduism is completely theistic and Buddhism is utterly non-theistic. Eventually, those practices became more and more popular. Buddhism, as it evolved in India, was a mostly monastic phenomena. And so it existed in monasteries and also in great universities where Buddhists entertained all the different religions, Hinduism, Jainism, whatever happened to be around, as well as Buddhism. The great universities were centers of learning. The most famous was Nalanda, which you can see the ruins of north of Bodh Gaya in India, where Bodh Gaya is where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And north of there, only about an hour's drive or so, hour and a half, is the ruins of Nalanda, which went as far as it was huge, absolutely huge. Supposedly at its height, it housed 10,000 people, all studying different things and collaborating. There were other great universities as well. And so what happened was that somewhere around the 5th or 6th century AD, Tantrism moved out of the forests and moved into the great universities, Nalanda, Odantapuri, Vikramasila, and others, and flourished there as a third path. And so we have these three paths, the so-called Hinayana, foundational teachings, which came out of the Buddha's original teachings, supposedly, the Mahayana, which was an evolution of those teachings, and then the Vajrayana, which was seen as a further evolution of those teachings. All of them contained the ones that went before. Very little was rejected, although sometimes, for instance, in the Mahayana, a particular doctrine would define itself as a denial of a Hinayana doctrine, a doctrine that had gone before. An example of this, at the Hinayana stage of the path, and in the Hinayana teachings, we encounter the doctrine of egolessness, anatma in Sanskrit. Nonetheless, in the Hinayana teachings, it was asserted that while I is a myth, a lie, ego, other exists. Not quite in the way we think it does, but it exists as all of the others that we see around us, the trees, the greenery, other people, are made up of little atoms of experience. They're not literally atoms like modern physics. These are atoms of experience. There's blue, there's soft, there's sweet. They're all the different qualities. There were actually a list of about, depending on the school, roughly 80 to 100 of these atoms. They were called dharmas, and they were meant to be considered to actually exist, that they had a lifespan, very, very brief. It's really your experience. As you see this experience, like you're looking at your screen and the colors are changing, the words are coming out and disappearing. These are dharmas in the Hinayana sense. The Theravada, the Viravada, the Mahasangikas even. And the idea is that these experiences, these little atoms of experience, are born, endure, and die very, very fast. In fact, the analogy for their speed is that if you were to stack 60 flower petals and drive a pin through them, the amount of time it takes for the pin to go through each petal is the amount of time that a dharma, a moment of experience, as it were, endures, is born, endures, and dies. So this was the doctrine of the Hinayana school. Later, the Mahayana school came along and said, nope, not even that. Not only does I not exist, but neither does anything out there as other. And this became the doctrine of Shunyata. So there was to some degree, working with previous doctrines and either refining them or even denying them and establishing new positions. The doctrine of emptiness, shunyata, which is key to the Mahayana, was a denial of the Hinayana doctrine of the existence of dharmas, of others out there that make up your windows, your sounds, all the objects of the senses and thoughts. They were dharmas too. Thoughts, anger, clarity, understanding, jealousy, all these were dharmas. And what the doctrine of the Mahayanists, the doctrine of emptiness, shunyata, said, nope, not even that. Nothing has any true being. And so each school built on either by accepting and incorporating the doctrines of the previous yana, or by defining a new position as a refinement or a denial of the old position. And this went on for centuries and is still going on. This is the way Buddhism works. Buddhism is a constant conversation, a constant refinement of the way to put things. Words are just regarded as useful ways to put things. Useful how? To particular people at a particular time in a particular place. The Buddha even taught to some group of people that the self does exist. And that produced a school after his death called the Pudgala Vadans. Pudgala is one word for self, and Vadans again is the people who believe in it. So everything. What he said was ever useful to help people awaken to reality. And what does reality mean? What does it mean to awaken to reality? The very essence of suffering, as he taught in the Four Noble Truths and in the Three Marks of Existence, is the wish that things were otherwise. The feeling that it's not good enough for me. I've got to change it. And that suffering involves imagining an alternative way of being, an alternative world, and that we want to proceed to it. And what the Buddha said is that very structure of regarding oneself as a person who is traveling to a better place is the very essence of suffering itself. Because in it, we are denying the value, the beauty, the worthwhileness of this life and saying, no, it's going to be something that I discover in the future. And so in this chapter, he says at the end, towards the end, you take the journey in order to realize that you are not going anywhere, that you're actually already there, that the problem was you thought you had to go somewhere else, and that made this of second value. He says, on the way on this journey, you are shedding your ego, because the ego is the only one who wants to get something better. So you're trying to surrender it completely, but when you reach the final destination, you realize that you have returned back home. You have gone in circles. And that's a tremendous discovery that we were already there, that this is in fact home. This is in fact it. We just think it's not. Literally, we think this is not good enough. And we see this world through that lens of not good enough. And in doing that, we make it less than. So he also says, the only thing happening is your mind. Mind is the journeyer. The particular style of working with yourself is the vehicle, and the situations you get into are the path. And then what we're doing is, and then he said, the Lankavatara Sutra, he quotes, saying that as long as there is the existence of conceptual mind, there is no end to the yanas, because that is the whole function of conceptual mind, is to say, it's going to be better than this. And here's what it's going to look like. That's what concept does. And it is the source of suffering. And that when one reaches the end, the conceptual mind is seen in a completely different way. It's just sort of a useful way to take things. It's like you take the word table, write it on a tag, and tie it to the table here. There's the reality of the table that I'm sitting at, and there is the tag, the concept. That's all concepts are. They're tags. And in fact, the Tibetan word for concept is also translated tag. It's just a tag that is affixed to the reality of our experience. And so we're going on this long journey like the kids looking for their dad in order to finally realize that we were there all along, that this is it. And not in some sad way, this is it. Like, oh, darn, I guess this is all there is. No, it's an entirely joyful way of celebrating the beauty and the reality of this world. And then in the next chapter, he goes on to relating with a teacher. He says, in the Hinayana, we work with our basic anxiety. This is the way we come to the path. We come wanting to deal with this suffering that we've got, our anxiety, our unhappiness, wishing that things were otherwise, trying to imagine them as being better. He says, you look for a physician to prescribe medicine, a teacher to prescribe teachings and practices to enable you to tread the path, to work on yourself, to make your own discoveries. And that's what a teacher does. Early on, you discover that there is pain, misery, neurosis, and anxiety. We knew that, but it's identified as being the problem on the path. Then you need to talk to somebody who can help, can keep you on track. Finding such a teacher seems to be absolutely necessary, he says. You need someone who sees through you completely, but still loves you. Oh boy. Difficult to find, not in your parents, cronies, or relatives. Someone who sees through you completely. Or at least to whatever extent you can, find such a person. A teacher is different from other people in that he or she is removed from the passions that seduce you. And you need that teacher to say yes or no to this and that. Go do this, don't do that. To steer you on the path, this circular path of coming back to what was already there. You just didn't want it. You just thought it had to be something different. This is what it means to be a samsaric, confused person. We're already there, but we think we're not, and we want something different. And we're going to go find it, search for it. I'll make a realization, and then I'll get it. So the terms, he gives terms for the teacher. He only talks about the Hinayana version of the teacher, which is the Slavira. Slavira means elder. And he points out that in Pali, I don't know if he pointed it out or I did. No, he says, he talks about it as being Tara in Pali, and in Sanskrit, it's Slavira. And in Japan, I guess, I didn't know this, Roshi means elder. And old in wisdom, old in discipline, old in terms of familiarity with the Dharma. So that actually the teacher changes its nature on the three basic levels of the path. At the Hinayana level, it's an elder, someone who knows the path, knows the doctrines, and can teach you the ground rules as well as these doctrines and how to behave properly at this stage of the path. As one moves through the path on this vehicle, remember, yana means cart. We're riding on a cart. And as one moves further into the Mahayana, the great vehicle, then the teacher, the name for teacher changes and becomes Kalyana Mitra. Kalyana means spiritual. Mitra, M-I-T-R-A, means friend. Kalyana, K-A-L-Y-A-N-A. It's not in this chapter, but it's something you need to know. And that's what happens at the Mahayana stage of the path. The teacher becomes a spiritual friend. There's a warmth in the relationship. At the Hinayana stage of the path, there's authority. And the teacher's sort of high, the higher up, an elder, a scholar perhaps, someone who knows a lot. At the Mahayana stage of the path, the teacher becomes much more the embodiment of the teachings and has a quality of friendship and love for you. And at the Vajrayana stage of the path, the teacher becomes what's called the Vajra, the indestructible master. Here, the teacher is introducing you to the absolute, unequivocal reality. And there's a harshness as well as a delight in this quality of pleasure. Also, so we go back to the Hinayana, this foundational stage of the path, which contains so much doctrine. We're going to be going through it. You know, the Four Noble Truths, the three marks of existence, Pratitya Samutpada, which means dependent co-origination, the 12 nidanas, which describe the chain of causality and karma. And we're going to be going through that. And all of this moves on into and is incorporated into the Mahayana. It's just that the understanding of what these things are and what their import is changes. It's like the atmosphere around them changes. And so in the Vajrayana, very little, if anything, is left behind. So another term for the teacher is Sanskrit is acharya, which means foremost teacher. The Tibetan for that is Lopan. Trungpa Rinpoche gave that title Lopan to one of his students, a fellow named Eric Holm, and he became the Lopan Dorje. What's his last name? I can't remember the second word in his refuge name. Oh well. And he lives in Halifax. And it means someone who's very smart, who really knows all the doctrine and understands a lot of the teachings. So it means foremost teacher. It says Lop means learning and Pun means chief. And finally, there is the Lama in Tibetan, Uttara in Sanskrit, and it means the person who is above. That's what Lama means. It's not the same thing as guru at all. Rather, it means Uttara. Uttara in Sanskrit. Guru's Sanskrit as well. He says, so the teacher is a super porter who can carry the heaviest load, the load of your suffering. And the teacher is also made heavy by learning, wisdom, and discipline. The teacher, she, is able to carry other people's neuroses or burdens and can carry people across the river of samsara. Another term for the teacher is upadhyaya, which is the term that we're more familiar with would be Khenpo. Khenpo literally means one who knows, and he translates this as preceptor. He's the person with whom you take the refuge vow, who enters you into the path of individual salvation. When you take the refuge vow, you enter the first yana, the Hinayana. Trungpa Rinpoche preferred to call this, rather than the lesser vehicle, which is literally what Hinayana means. See, it was kind of a slam named by the Mahayanists. They would say, oh, that's the lesser vehicle. He calls it the foundational vehicle. And it's so true, because all the doctrines and teachings of the Hinayana just, they inhere in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. You don't leave them behind. In fact, they become transformed and given further depth. So at this point, the Khenpo is a doctor who makes you take your medicine and promises that you'll be cured. And he talks about now conducting oneself with elegance and delight. So in our relationship with a teacher, we are connecting with the attitude and concepts the teacher represents, with their learning and their care for self and others. This is what the teacher represents. Above all, learning, care for self and others, experience with all these practices and understanding of how they work and what they're going to do for and to each one of us. This allows us to become inspired and meticulous. That means that we really want to practice and study, and we do it more and more. He says teachers represent the absence of neurosis by manifesting as 100% persons who are basically on top of their situation. They are healthy and precise and inspired by the Dharma and the delight of teaching. Trungpa Rinpoche was a Vajra master. He wasn't a Hinayana teacher, which is simply a preceptor. He wasn't a Mahayana teacher. I've encountered Mahayana teachers. I had a dear friend who came from, he was a Roshi. Initially, he wasn't. I'm blanking his name. Somebody help me here. Senior moment, sorry. This guy came from Japan. He was a student, he was a confrere of Suzuki Roshi, and he came and lived in our community here. And he was marvelous. He was so sweet. And he was a real Mahayana teacher, Japanese. Although there are teachers at every level among the Zen tradition as well. He says, the quality of meticulousness, that means, and I can see him as he would say this, he'd be holding like a cup of tea or a glass of scotch with such delicacy and bringing it to his lips and taking a sip and putting it down with complete awareness. There was always that quality of utter awareness. I remember one time he was giving a talk and he had a glass of scotch beside him on the table, and his hand knocked it off and it spilled on the floor. Everyone was horrified. It was so unlike him. And he just looked at everybody with a big grin. And, it was part of who he was too. So he says this quality of meticulousness, of the way in which you bring a teacup to your lips with such awareness, doesn't mean one is blissed out. It means that you are conducting yourself precisely with elegance and delight. I'm sorry, the person I was trying to think of who I regarded as a true spiritual friend, a Kalyana Mitra, was Kobun Chino. His name was Kobun Chino. First, he was Kobun Chino Sensei. Sensei means priest, roughly. And then he was promoted and became Kobun Chino Roshi. And he was such a sweet guy. And I took him skiing. My wife and I had a place up in Beaver Creek at the time. And I took him up there. He was I called him a kamikaze skier. He just went down the mountain with his hands out like this, straight down. It was terrifying to watch. No turns, just full blast. And I remember talking to him after skiing. We were sitting at a table in the townhouse that we had. And I told him, I said, there are such examples of true bodhisattvas, super intense bodhisattvas, like Mother Teresa, who has donated every instant of her life, it seems, to helping other people. And I said, I'm not like that. Maybe I should really change my life and go be more of benefit to other people. We're sitting at a table in the dining room, and he looks at me across the table and says, a bodhisattva is a person who finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table. To be a bodhisattva is to be responsive and aware in the moment, appropriately, in the particular situation you find yourself in, that your karma has put you in. And to do anything else, like to go and try and model yourself on Sister Teresa, is an act of egotism, really. That's the way I took it, what he was saying. He said a bodhisattva is a person who finishes the conversation with the person sitting across the table. It's a big smile. Covancino married, had a daughter. They were in Switzerland, sitting beside a lake, and the child wandered into the lake and drowned. Coben went in after her and drowned with her. And I know I have a friend who just died, Marty Moscow, some of you know Marty, died here in Boulder, and he was very close with Coben. Marty became a Roshi in the Zen tradition. He was also a student of Trungpa Rinpoche. I also went to college with Marty and knew him as an undergraduate. We were friends. And Marty is of the opinion that Coben deliberately went and drowned with his daughter in order to help her make the transition into death and the Bardos. Who knows? But it is sad. He was such a sweet guy, such a wonderful guy, and a wonderful teacher. So, oh, good. We've got a little bit of time left and not much to go in this chapter. He says, so the quality of meticulousness, that lifting the teacup so perfectly, doesn't mean one is blissed out. It means that you are conducting yourself precisely with elegance and delight. Precision is the key to how human beings can be raised to a higher level of potential. That awareness in the moment, present, not being distracted, with the simplest of things. He says the basic principle of elegance in the Buddhist point of view is quite different from the Victorian notion of good manners, which is kind of chimpanzee style imitation. The manners, you learn how to manipulate your knife and fork and address people and so forth. He says, as the best of beings, meaning enlightened or awake, aware, you have the decency to relate with your teacher, and you are decent in terms of your behavior patterns. That basic decency at a very ordinary and simple level will bring enlightenment, individual salvation, because we're coming into the present and we are learning how to appreciate our lives as they arise now. I'm going to stop there and we can have a discussion. I encourage you to contemplate this idea that this path is a circle and that we're coming home to where we already were. We just didn't know it. An appreciation for this that we're sitting in the midst of now. Comments, complaints, arguments.
Well, I confess I can certainly identify with the chimpanzee parroting of stuff, like I'll say, oh, Thich Nhat Hanh, or someone says be in the moment when you're washing the dishes, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna be in the moment washing the dishes, and I'm like, I'm being in the fucking moment washing the dishes, god damn, all the time hating it and thinking I want to be elsewhere and not getting into it. So that reminded me of going back to the previous chapter where it says the non-theistic journey is not based on rewards, but by moment feedback, which may be painful or punishing, gray, black, or white. The journey is not achievement oriented, but living oriented. you have some kinds of exchange taking place all the time, so you don't have to wait for your carrot. You get a carrot every minute. And I think, anyway, I see the two as related. At some point, dropping or giving in or opening up, whatever kind of metaphor or analogy to use about being with the dishes or being in a conversation or whatever, there's some kind of like dropping of the goal, I guess, like the point or the goal. It's not that I don't want the dishes to be clean or I don't want to communicate, but it's something other than an imposition that I have to get through to the next thing. And I guess just as kind of like free thinking, that leads to what you were talking about in terms of kind of this is it. It's not, there's going to be an insight along the way. I just got to get through the dishes and then I'll do something where I'll get the insight. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that. That especially the thing about the elegance and the tea and stuff, that was kind of a painful reminder of how easily I see that. I try to parrot that, but it's not successful when I'm doing it with one mindset, with a certain mindset, I guess.
That's great. Thank you. In the advanced teachings of Vajrayana, they say that the enlightened person has nothing left to do except play. The term in Tibetan is rolpa, means play. We can all experience this somewhat when we're gently and kindly present with other people. We might notice that we feel more affection and happiness. The two go together. Joy and concern. Joy in general and concern for the people around us. Compassion for them. The saner we get, the more we are able to be inspired by this life and the beings in it. And all we want to do is, increasingly, is to interact with them. Rolpa, this idea of play, Rinpoche said it's like a dance. It's communication. It's making love. It's a constant interaction. And that's all the enlightened person has to do. And it's great fun, enjoyment, even when it's painful. I remember when he was approaching his death, it was in the 1980s. Japan was in its heyday. Matsushita, Sony, all the televisions and all the devices and computers and everything coming out of Japan. And at one point he said, and I've never forgotten this, he said he didn't want to be reborn as a teacher, the 12th Trungpa. He was going to be reborn as a Japanese scientist. That's what he wanted. We all laughed. But I know where it was coming from. It was coming from that idea of that at the Vajrayana level, the enlightened level, you can practice Vajrayana practices in order to get enlightened, and they're also a description of enlightened mind when they're done perfectly. And that the practitioner at that stage, the enlightened person, has different names because there's still a progression of enlightenment. The final stage, beyond, is called, he called it old dog. At the final stage of the path, after you go through all these different iterations of the path, you're like an old dog lying there in the dirt, swiping flies away with its tail. You're sleepy. That's the final stage of the path. But before that, there's a lot of stuff that goes on at the Vajrayana stage. You can become a siddha, a power holder, and other things, magician. But it's all about enjoyment of this phenomenal world that we live in, and of the communication, the dance, the participation, and the opening of one's heart as well as one's mind to no purpose other than play, rolpa, or not, because the enlightened person can also just disappear, go poof, disappear into the Dharmakaya. I don't know what governs those options, rolpa or disappearing into the Dharmakaya. I really don't. But they say, that when you die, you go through these different stages of death, and at the complete moment of death, which is beyond what Western medicine would call death. Western medicine calls death shutting down the body. But Buddhism says that even when the body is completely shut down, the mind is still alive. And that has to shut down. And there is a description of how that happens in the death teachings. And there are stages. And when it finally shuts down, if a person has practiced enough in this lifetime and has seen enough and understood enough, they will merge with reality. The Dharmakaya, it's called, the body of the truth. And they cease to exist in any way as an individual, unless they choose not to. And they can do that. And when they don't, when they choose not to, they come back. They take rebirth, go through the next two bardos. There are two more bardos, two more stages. One is called the bardo of reality, and then the second one is called the bardo of becoming. And they take rebirth as what? As a teacher, in order to help other people along the path. This is what tulkus are. This is why, the current Karmapa is the 17th Karmapa, the 17th in his line. The Dalai Lama is, what is he, the 13th, I think, in his line. They've come back out of compassion. What does compassion mean? Love, communication, enjoyment. Trungpa Rinpoche was the 11th in his line. Now the 12th lives in Tibet. So they come back out of love, pleasure. I asked him once, I said, maybe is it like, that when the person dies, they were in the middle of a conversation and they want to come back to carry it on. And he says, yeah, I kind of like that. But the message that we keep getting is that this is it. We just think it's not. We just think someday I'm going to understand. Someday I'll get enlightened. Someday I'll leave this veil of tears and achieve heaven. What these teachings are saying is no, no, no. Sorry. Beautiful teachings. And by the way, one more little thing. We've talked about the three yanas, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. There are subdivisions. And the Hinayana is broken down into two. We'll get to this. One is called the Slavirayana. Slavira means hearers. The hearers of the teachings. That's the first one, the first division of the Hinayana. And then the second one is called the Pratyeka Buddhayana, which means self-enlightened Buddha. And this is a person who has understood egolessness, but hasn't quite gotten to the non-existence of dharmas, of others, gotten to, understood the non-existence of the self, but still sees the world as rising and existing and dying. And then the Mahayana is one yana. It's also called the Bodhisattva yana, but it has 10 subdivisions called bhumis. Bhumi literally means earth. So it's like 10 stages. And we'll get into that at some point. The 10 stages of the Mahayana, they're quite beautiful and profound. And then the Vajrayana. There are 2 different schemas for subdividing the Vajrayana. The Kagyu sect, Trungpa Rinpoche was Kagyu. Kagyu literally means, they're one of the 4 sects of Tibetan Buddhism: Kagyu, Sakya, Nyingma, and Gelugpa. Dalai Lama is Gelugpa. I don't really know any, I've never studied with any Sakya teachers, although they're around for sure. And then the Nyingma and the Kagyus are very close. Nyingma means the old ones. They trace their lineage back to Padmasambhava, who is generally considered to have established Buddhism in Tibet. It arrived about 100 years before Padmasambhava, more than, but it didn't really take hold until Padmasambhava came. And so the Nyingmas traced their lineage back to Padmasambhava. The Kagyus and all the others came later. What happened was that the Nyingmas developed, and then there was this evil king of Tibet who suppressed Buddhism for about 100 years, until somebody, actually for less than 100 years, because somebody killed him. A mad monk shot him with an arrow in his eye. And that king died, and then Buddhism slowly came back. And then the other 3 sects, Sakya, Gelugpa, and Kagyu, developed from around starting in the 11th century with the Kagyu, into the 14th century with the Gelugpa was the last one to develop. So anyhow, the Sakya, the Gelugpa, the Nyingma sect subdivides the Vajrayana into 6 sub-yanas. They're called the lower and the upper sometimes, the 3 lower and the 3 upper yanas, whereas the Kagyus have 4 subdivisions. And we'll get into that. Trungpa Rinpoche's root guru was Nyingma, and so he taught both schemes, and I think that he really favored the Nyingma scheme with 6 subdivisions. Ending in the 6th was, maybe you've heard of this, the Great Perfection, called Dzogchen. Dzogchen literally means, Dzog means perfect, Chen means great. So the Great Perfection. In Sanskrit, it was called Mahasandhi. And sometimes it's just referred to as Ati. Ati is the last letter, I think it's the last or the first, I think it's the last in the Tibetan alphabet. And so it kind of means when you call it Ati, you're saying ne plus ultra. There's nothing beyond that. And he taught Dzogchen a lot. And we'll be going through it. We're struggling with the 3rd volume of the Profound Treasury. We've taken a break and we're going into Tralig's book because it gets pretty intense. And there are also practices in there that I'm not authorized to give to you. You have to have special authorization. That doesn't mean you can't have them at all. When we get there, when the time is appropriate, we will ask some of our Tibetan friends to come and give you the initiations. And then people like me and Michael, we can teach you how to do them. We're just not authorized to give the initiation, the Abhisheka, at least yet. Sorry, I've been going on and on. Do you have anything, Dave? I can see you reacting.
No, no, I just like the teaching. But I want to mention, I went to a weekend teaching with a Sakya Lama in New York City.
Sakya Trinzen, probably.
It could, I was looking for his name the other day. This is about 5 years ago. And
Mhm.
he was actually very good and also very, very funny. He had said something, it was, the teaching was kind of part of this larger meditation in different religious traditions course that was being presented by the New York Open Center. So the Tibetans were represented by this Lama, and throughout the weekend, people kept on asking him, because they really weren't from the Tibetan tradition. People kept on asking him for a secret mantra. They wanted like a secret mantra to. So eventually, he got frustrated and he said, "You want a secret mantra? How about kindness? How about
Kind.
kindness? How about," he said, "imagine if everybody in this city was getting up in the subway to give other people their seats. How would that be for a magical transformation?" And
That's great.
yeah, it was. It was a good.
I think that as you progress along the path, we begin to tune in to our sanity, which includes happiness, warmth, and the desire to love other people, and the desire and ability to love others and want to be of service naturally, not out of some principle of idealism,
Yeah.
but out of heart, because it's beautiful. So the world is really transforming.
And I would just add to that, it's also a lot more fun, right?
Yeah, 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 I think so. I think Jim Rinpoche had a lot of fun.
Well, that's what I got out of your vignette, John, about him knocking over his glass of scotch and laughing. It's not taking himself too seriously in the midst of being precise and present with people, but also not being too serious.
Oh yeah. I told this story, I don't know, did I tell it to you about him at the University of Chicago? No? Um, I went to the University of Chicago and I couldn't stay because Nixon took away draft deferments for first year graduate students that year, 1967, 8. So I went and did other things. And then I met Trump Rinpoche, and then he was speaking there, and I went with him. And we went to this hall where I had gone for lectures on Chinese history and things like that, because that's what I was studying in graduate school. And we were standing outside the hall, and it was pretty full, 200 or 300 people in there. And he always, when he taught, he often smoked a cigarette and had a glass of scotch in his hand. You'll see him in videos doing that. And he asked me as we stood outside the door, and all these people were going in, and he said, "Can I drink and smoke in there?" And I, you'll have to, you can be critical. I said, "What's the matter? Can't you do without a smoke and a drink for an hour?" And he just looked at me and he said, "I just don't want there to be any mistake." Isn't that something? He wanted them to know just who he was and what this was about. I think he drank, but not smoked. I can't remember. I don't think he could smoke in there. Well, we're getting towards the end. Anybody have questions, complaints, suggestions? I hear somebody's birds. It's nice.
Miriam has a
Yes.
question.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. I wanted to say how much I appreciate your teachings, John. And there was some new stuff in there, you know, the way that you explained it came out differently somehow. And even though I listened to the lectures for this volume on YouTube, I'm finding something very rich in it once again, and I appreciate your tangents and stories.
Hmm.
Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've been over this material so many times, and every time it seems new. Maybe I'm just getting old and can't remember anything anymore. What was it? Somebody said one of the benefits of losing your mind is that you get to meet new people all the time, see the same movies, but they see them for the first time again. That kind of thing. Well, everyone, perhaps we should end. What do you think, Barry? Any more? Nope. Well, we'll say the closing chants. Let's see. Okay, I'll put them up. Oh, Don, do you want to lead?
I have my gong upstairs. I can
Okay.
run and get it if you want, unless someone has one available there.
No, I'll just do it.
Okay, thanks.
So we'll close with a prayer for peace and with the dedication of merit. And I'm going to mute all. By the blessings of enlightened and compassionate ones, by the power of my positive actions of 3 times in my prayers of pure aspiration, may wars, conflicts, epidemics, and all other maladies dissolve in this world, and may the earth and all who live on this earth enjoy the abundance of well-being. May all learn to live lovingly with each other. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom. May the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled.